Hello and welcome to the Justin Center podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again, as always, on the program today. And just a quick reminder that Justin Center as an organization is supported by donors. We do rely on you to be able to continue to do the things that we do here, including producing the content that we do in the form of books and the podcasts and other things as well. This video is going to be demonetized because of the nature. Well, I'm not even going to attempt to monetize it. So just the nature of the subject matter, this kind of thing can't be, as you'll see as you listen to this, some of this can't be monetized by YouTube. So it's not advertiser friendly, which means we're not going to be making money off this video. Not that I make a ton of money off these videos, but if you do want to support us and the things that we do here, you want to make up for the deficit of the money that we will not be making on this video, you can go to justcenter.org, go to our donate page. There, you can support us on Patreon, and there are all sorts of other ways that you can support us as well. So we are, I've done this series on the demonic that I started a while ago, and looking at demonic possession and examining just some elements of how deliverance ministries work and criticisms of hyper-charismatic approaches to deliverance, but also talking about the reality of the demonic and the reality of evil spiritual realms, and the question of how is it that we do deal with those things from a conventional Lutheran approach. And something that I feel like kind of has to be addressed as we're talking about the demonic is the Satanic Panic. Now, the reason I say this is because as I went back and did a lot of the reading that I did in charismatic movements and looking at various approaches to the demonic, a lot of the textbooks, especially ones that were written in the 80s and 90s, rely heavily on a lot of testimonies to things that are satanic that have since been debunked in large measure. So we'll talk about that, what's debunked and what's not. So I just think that it's important culturally to talk about what was now is labeled as Satanic Panic, but what exactly was going on in the 1980s and the 1990s that caused this kind of widespread fear of this large satanic group. You still see elements of this within QAnon and some other groups that are active and around today as well. So a lot of these ideas do still exist in some circles. I know the cult leader Teal Swan says that she was part of this satanic cult, and a lot of people have used these stories, and clearly embellished stories, that it kind of gives them this terrible upbringing and this terrible background that they can then draw on to gain some sympathy and then gain an audience through that. But it's one of these things that's often brought up, and it's brought up by a lot of critics of the supernatural as well. So it's something that as a Christian, when you're bringing up the demonic or the reality of Satan or the reality of the supernatural, you're going to hear people bring up the Satanic Panic if you're talking to critics who are going to say, oh, you're just like one of those crazy, Salem witch trial kind of people, or you're just one of those crazy people who support the Satanic Panic. Now, first of all, with the Salem witch trials, one of the books that I read was on the Salem witch trials as I was preparing for a number of these podcasts. And if you do look at the historical documents of the Salem witch trials, well, it does develop into a panic and paranoia. And I think pretty much everybody acknowledges that there were some pretty weird witchcraft kind of events going on with a number of eyewitnesses that started off the Salem witch trials. And I think this is what you often see with the kind of panics and hysteria that people jump into in culture, is there's usually something behind it that's real, and then people kind of go wild with it, and it gets expanded just to such a degree that it ends up becoming this like paranoia, and people just start believing all sorts of things that aren't true. But if you look at the Salem witch trials, there are plenty of eyewitness testimonies of some weird supernatural things happening. And I'm talking about events where multiple people see things. So it doesn't appear to me that the whole story is just, well, those Puritans were all so backwards back then and believed really dumb things and thought people were witches. It's a lot more complex than that, and history is always more complex than that. And we always tend to want to view history through the lens of us being smarter than people in the past, and it's really easy to look back and be like, oh, they were dumb. They didn't know things back then. Something I brought up in other videos on the demonic was, for example, a lot of psychologists, secular psychologists, kind of paint the history of psychology in the sense that they would say, well, in a religious past, you had all this psychological disorders, psychological diseases, and people didn't know what to do with it because they hadn't studied the brain, they hadn't studied, this kind of phenomena. They didn't have a field that we now know as psychology that develops in the 19th century and then is really expanded significantly in the 20th century. So they were just kind of superstitious back then. So they just said, well, everything's just demons. Well, as I mentioned before, when you go through a lot of the sources from like the 17th century Protestant scholastics, they bring up the reality of psychological disorder. Now, they don't use the term psychological disorder, but they talk about mental problems. And when they're speaking about the demonic, they talk very explicitly about the importance of distinguishing from mental issues, diseases, hysteria. They use different terms, but they're talking about what we would now recognize as things like schizophrenia or, serious anxiety or depression or whatever. And they're clear to say, but that's different from this, what we would call demonic possession. So a lot of the way we tell history, especially a lot of the secular narrative of history, is very one-sided and is focused on, well, those religious people were really dumb and we know better now and we can look back at how stupid they were in the past. Okay, so how do we deal with then the Satanic Panic? What's going on here? So I want to say that there are some significant cultural movements that occur in the 1960s and 70s, which lead to this kind of paranoia. And one of those is there is the rise of the New Age movement. And so there are all sorts of alternative spiritualities that people begin practicing at this time. It becomes much more popular, especially with the hippies. So people are certainly turning away from a classical Judeo-Christian approach to religion in some form. And so they are moving into Eastern spiritualities and also doing things with spirits, conjuring the dead, the kind of things that the Old Testament warns about as being evil. And Christians have long recognized are tapping into what we would refer to as demonic sources. So a lot of that is going on at this time. And because of that, there is a kind of fear of what's going on. There is, Anton LaVey does found the Satanic Church. So that's a real thing that exists. Now, what people do with that and claim about that is going to get wild as we go on, and we could talk about some of that and some of the claims that are really unsubstantiated. But from a Christian perspective, calling upon spirits of the dead, or calling upon these other gods or spirit beings, these kinds of things have traditionally been associated with the demonic. So you're calling out to spirits that are not of God, and that is tapping into a kind of demonic realm. And Christians have always recognized this, but this goes back to the Old Testament. This goes back to that which is forbidden for the Jews. So these things don't come from nowhere. Now, I do want to say, when the 1960s and 70s, occur, a lot of the New Age movement arises. It's not like that's a totally new thing. So spiritism, seances, theosophy. There are a lot of these movements that pre-exist the 60s and 70s pretty significantly. I read a novel not too long ago, it was a couple years ago, by Edith Wharton, who's my favorite. She's my favorite author. But she wrote the one novel she wrote about the 1920s, which was later in her life. She usually writes about the high society in the 1870s. But in that book, she talks about kind of shows the popular trends of what's going on in the 20s among like the flappers, the young people, the people that, F. Scott Fitzgerald writes about. And it was so fascinating to read a lot of the spiritualism and the kinds of things that people were talking about, because it sounds so much like what we see as the New Age, or, what we see today in the rise of paganism and Wicca and all sorts of alternative spirituality. So that was a trend in the 1920s for younger people to get interested in. And you go back to the 19th century, there was a rise of a lot of spiritualism in the 19th century. This is when you have like the first ghost sightings and photographs and early photography, and all sorts of weird stories start up about ghosts and about evil spirits, and seances become really popular. And there are all sorts of ways that people realize they can start to make money off of this stuff by claiming that they're calling the spirits of the dead. And it's a really fascinating history. The 19th century, just religious history in the United States is quite a fascinating one. So at least in the United States, and I'm talking United States, I don't know what the case is in other countries. I'm really more familiar with U.S. history at that time in terms of religious history. So those who are more informed of what's going on, in Europe or wherever, other places in the world, I'd be interested to hear what's going on there. But that's not really my expertise. So at least in 19th century America, a lot of this is happening. And when we're talking the Satanic Panic, we are really talking about the United States. It's not exclusively in the United States, so there are things that are going on in England and France as well, but the roots of it are really in the United States. And that's where kind of the bulk of it is, and that's where it starts. And then it does spread to other places beyond there. And you could talk about it being in like South America and Africa as well, except they're not really dealing with a panic because they're dealing with things like voodoo and actual demonic stuff that is actually, engaged in there. But us, Westerners are so secularized that we don't tend to believe any of that stuff is real. So we just think it's all superstition, which is wrong. It's not healthy and not true. So then let's talk about. Okay, so we've got the background then of the 1960s and 70s. You've got kind of the rise of the New Age movement, people looking into Eastern spiritualities, and a lot of Christians are very fearful of where things are going religiously, but also morally, because you have the sexual revolution, and you have the free love movement and the hippies in the 1960s. And so there is a fear, especially for young people, like parents with young people, teenagers. You have the development of teenage culture as well in the 1950s. And in the midst of a lot of these fears, and I think a lot of them are rightly founded fears, because they are fears of getting into these alternative spiritualities, which I think you are messing with spirits that aren't good. And there is a real thing called the Satanic Church and the Satanic Bible. And so a lot of that, the fear of instability, religious instability, and cultural and moral instability in the United States then leaves people, I think, open for hearing the things that are to be heard that now later become identified as the Satanic Panic. So then let's delve into what is some of the history here and who are some of the major figures that impact this movement and some of these ideas within the United States. So there are a lot of individuals that are associated with this and the rise of this, but I think there are probably three major individuals that are behind a lot of the initial worry and paranoia surrounding this movement. And those figures are, there's Mike Warnke, there's John Todd, and then there is the publication of a book called Michelle Remembers. So we're going to talk about all three of these things and the validity of these three things, and then what we see developing into what is referred to often as the Satanic Panic. So let's start with Mike Warnke. Now, Mike Warnke, he's my friend on Facebook, and I think he's a friend of actually a lot of people on Facebook that I know. He added me. I didn't look for him. So he's still around, and I believe he's Anglican at this point, I think. I've seen him with a clerical collar on. But Mike Warnke was a comedian, a popular Christian comedian in the he was really most popular in the 1980s. But he started speaking in the 1970s. Now, you can find some of his routines, his comedy routines, if you look. But he basically, in the 70s and 80s, and he was found out, we'll talk about, he was a popular speaker. He's a kind of charismatic type of speaker. He's somebody that's very engaging. But he would mix these kind of comedy routines with his testimony. And his testimony was pretty profound and powerful. Now, to give you a little more kind of religious context to what's going on at this time, the 1970s was the era of what's known as the Jesus people, or the Jesus movement. Specifically, a lot of West Coast Christianity, but not just on the West Coast. If you think of Calvary Chapel, Chuck Smith, and Alani Frisbee and some other kind of hippie type preachers, where you have a lot of aspects of the kind of hippie counterculture coming into the church, but it's an anti-counterculture movement, and it's a traditionalist Christian movement in some ways, but really they eschew historic liturgical forms of worship. Things are much more free and they're much more open. People are using new kinds of music within worship. This is where you get the birth of what we think of as contemporary worship music. Things are much more informal at church. There's less of an emphasis on clergy. All of this is part of that Jesus people movement. And focus on eschatology as well. You see a lot of doomsday kind of prophesying within the Jesus people movement, very dispensational theologically, looking toward the return of Christ. Often there are these prophecies of Jesus's return at different points throughout the Jesus people movement. And Mike Warnke really appeals to a lot of people within that movement. Now, a lot of the movement was propelled by the telling of testimonies. And it's not like that's new there. I mean, the telling of testimonies is older than that, but it's very much an American religious phenomenon that it becomes so central. You do find roots of it in 18th century pietism in Germany, but I think America probably has this focus on the conversion story, probably more than anyone else and anywhere else in church history, but especially with that Jesus people movement, because you have people coming out of a lifestyle that is a hippie lifestyle, one that is free love, orgies. You've got people with doing all sorts of kind of drugs. You've got LSD and alcoholism, kind of all of these wild things. But with the Jesus people movement, people are coming out of all sorts of wild lifestyles and now converting to Christianity, and they've got a story to tell. They've got a story to tell about how God saved them, and the story often involves all sorts of drug abuse and other things. And these stories become, on the one hand, I think it can be very encouraging to people, so I don't want to say it's all negative, because you can see how God can bring people out of these terrible backgrounds and circumstances. But there becomes a kind of temptation, I think, to embellish your story, because your spirituality is sometimes judged in light of like how bad you were before. And so the better Christian you are now is dependent upon how bad you were before your conversion, because then you've got a really cool story that's really captivating, and you can tell all the bad details about all the terrible stuff you used to do. And this is still a problem within evangelicalism, and this is part of the reason I think why people are moving largely into more historic and liturgical traditions in the church today, because I think it's unsustainable. And it can lead to like people being raised in a Christian household and not really rebelling like crazy and just staying faithful, to feeling kind of like they're second-class citizens in the kingdom of God. It's like, I didn't have a wild story. Maybe I should go and do something crazy and then convert. But there is a tendency for people then to start to kind of create this backstory as part of their story, because they feel like it's kind of necessary as a Christian. You've got to have a good testimony. Now, that's especially true for somebody who is trying to be a public figure. You're trying to get a career, say in comedy, as Warnke is. You're trying to make a career, you're trying to make a name for yourself, and you want people to be inspired by your story. So you start to kind of make some stuff up or make things sound a little wilder than they really are. You find this more recently with the story of Ergen Cantor, if you're familiar with that story about, he was a man, he taught at Liberty, and I don't know what's happened to him recently, but I think this is the same kind of story where you have someone who has all these details about, he was an Islamic terrorist, supposedly. He was raised in this, and he's got this whole backstory, and it's a really powerful, if you listen to his messages, you're like, whoa, this is powerful. And this happens after 9/11, because now everybody's scared of Islam. So if you have someone who's got their testimony that's based in that, they're going to get a lot of listeners, and people are going to be fascinated. How did someone come out of that radical Islamic background and come into Christianity? And it just became really obvious from not even that much research that a lot of the details of his story are just not true. So that's still a temptation today, and that was much more recent. I think that was 10 years ago that all came out, and I don't know what happened with him since. But so this is something that happens with Mike Warnke. Now so with his comedy routine, and honestly, the guy could have been pretty successful if he just like did his comedy and talked about Jesus and gave a regular testimony. I think there's nothing wrong with that. But in the early 70s, this is 1972, he starts speaking about his background in Satanism, supposedly. And he published a book in 1972 called The Satan Seller. Now, The Satan Seller, so this is this is prior to what we think of as the Satanic Panic. So this is kind of the first push toward the Satanic Panic, all the way back in 1972. So in this book called the Satan Seller, and you could still find it online if you want to read it. I mean, it's a kind of wild story. But he has this story about how he was introduced to Satanism as a child. He was orphaned, he was abused, and then he's introduced to Satanism. He eventually becomes a high priest. He's a high priest of Satanism. And then in this, satanic group, there's this coven that he's a part of. There are like hundreds, thousands of people that are part of this. He engages in all sorts of pretty wild, horrific rituals and violence. We're talking about, sexually abusing other people, being abused himself, talking about sacrificing children, killing babies, kind of any horrific thing that you could think of. Supposedly, Mike Warnke was a part of this. And there were drugs involved as well. And he's also got this whole story of his time in Vietnam. So he's got this kind of military part of the story that's also exciting. And he's wounded a couple different times. So this is it's a crazy story, And if you hear the details of the story, you have a hard time really believing that it could possibly be true, because it doesn't seem to really make sense. Now, you have to recognize, of course, going back to 1972, you don't have the same kind of resources that we have with the internet today. It's not easy to go and do, some research about these things and find information about what's going on, because this is supposedly this is an underground movement, and supposedly there are these satanic elites that are underneath a lot of happenings and a lot of events in the world. This often gets connected to the Illuminati conspiracies later on. And so according to Warnke, there is this satanic underground, the secret satanic underground. And this is not just part of what we think of as the Satanic Church of Anton LaVey, but these are darker and more evil groups, because the Satanic Church of Anton LaVey supposedly claims it doesn't believe in a literal Satan. And then you've got the Temple of Set and some other weird groups that start too. But this is to say that this is something like serious. They're doing human sacrifices. They're doing as many wicked things as you could possibly imagine. So people didn't have a way to verify or to check these things. And probably most people are like, oh, we've heard about the Satanic Church, because they know that exists. They probably haven't researched it at all. They know that a lot of the hippies got really into drugs, and they know that these other spiritualities are popular, and they see the issues in the world today. And it's probably easy for them to buy into this as a narrative to explain what's going on in the world. They'd say, okay, well, maybe this is why things are so bad. And this is something we're kind of always looking for when we see evil in the world. This is just psychologically, we have a need for this, is we want to find an enemy. We want to say, here is an easy explanation for why things are so bad in the world. Here is why culture has gotten the way that it is. It's X group of people. Because when you do that, you say, well, if we can get rid of X, we fix the problems in the world. And that's, I think, what's so attractive about the rise of Illuminati conspiracies as well, or the deep state. You have different forms of that kind of conspiracy developing at different points. But the roots of those conspiracies are, I think, psychologically, it's this human need and desire to explain things, to have a way to a narrative, to give yourself a way to look at the evil in the world and see it as something that's conquerable. And I certainly think there is a narrative, and I think it's a narrative of sin, but the narrative of sin in general is a lot more complicated. It becomes a lot more messy just to say, well, there is sin that impacts all world structures, that impacts all people, that impacts all cultures in all areas of society, because it doesn't give you an enemy to say, here is the bad person, here is the bad group, they are causing it. And you have bad groups, but you just have sin everywhere. So it's a much more complicated, less black and white, here I can be the good guy, you can be the bad guy kind of system. But that's not how the world works. And I think, as understanding Christianity and understanding the realities of sin and the way that Scripture describes it, it is complicated. The people of God, the people in Israel, they're often the bad guys, but they're also often the good guys. And usually they're kind of both. So that's because sin affects all of us in these different ways. But the kind of narrative of this satanic group or satanic cabal really just simplifies it enough that you can pinpoint and point your finger at those are the bad guys. That's how we deal with the issues we're facing. So Warren Key got this book was a decent seller. It started to sell pretty well. The Satan Seller sold well, but he really got more popular after he started recording some of his talks. And so in 1975, he had the first recorded album. Now these are vinyl of a comedy presentation, which also includes some of the details about his satanic abuse. And I think because of his charismatic personality, because when you listen to him, he's a good storyteller, right? He's really engaging. This is really what sells it, I think, more than the book. This is the reason why this became believable, because if you hear a guy who's got a good story and he's really good at telling those stories and you have no way to verify it, you kind of get sucked into it. And I think that's really what was key about Warren Key, and that is what led him to fame in a much bigger way. So he started speaking at a lot of churches in the mid-70s, and they're charismatic churches. He is popular in charismatic circles. Now, this makes sense that it's charismatic circles because the charismatics are the ones that are really interested in a couple things that Warren Key is really speaking to. One is they're really interested in the reality of the spiritual realm and the reality of spiritual warfare. Now, if that's where the charismatics are, here you've got a guy saying, look, I have been like in the heart of it. I've been there with spiritual warfare. I've been on both sides. I've seen the demonic realm in its most powerful forms, and I was part of it, and Jesus rescued me out of it. So you've got that. But the second part is the charismatic emphasis on personal experience. Because there is this kind of inward turn in charismaticism, largely, people spend a lot of time talking about their personal conversion, their personal experiences with God. So the more radical your experience with God is, in a way, the more spiritual you are. Like that's kind of how you get your fame within charismatic circles. And, and I don't want to bash another tradition by any means, but there's not a lot of discernment in the charismatic circles at this time. And I think you see that with some of the other texts that I reference, and you have the rise of the Word of Faith movement and some really wild ideas. There just really is not a lot of discernment in those circles. It's kind of a focus on experience, and a lot of times you just take people, their testimony or their word kind of at face value. So that, that's really the place where Warren Key really gets a lot of attention. Now, there's a lot of other stuff that goes on at this time. There's an affair that happens. He divorces his wife and all of that, which honestly, a lot of the more popular charismatic leaders at that time kind of all do the same thing. I think there's probably reasons for that, but I don't know. So that, that's of course a red flag of okay, well, maybe he's not being consistent with living in his faith, and that not only does he have an affair, but he doesn't try to reconcile with his wife, but he's but I'm going to go be with the woman that I had an affair with, which is not exactly consistent with biblical morality. So he ends up getting much more popular once it gets to about the year 1980. Now, he started speaking about, and you see this with a lot of people within this movement at this time, he starts speaking about how satanic ideas have trickled into popular culture, and how they've trickled into a lot of things that we just do and observe as a society. One of those is the celebration of Halloween. And so he's got this whole story about Halloween and how the Satanists observe the day of Halloween. And so he's urging Christian parents not to let their kids celebrate Halloween. And I think the fear-driven approach of Warren Key really brings him even more fame, because if, as a parent, I know this, right? When someone says there's a threat to your kids, you're going to listen. If there's a threat to my kids, I want to know. This is how parents are. And they at least they should be, right? You should care about your kids enough that that is the thing that makes you listen, right? So if he says there's a threat to your kids, you're going to be okay, what is it? I want to make sure that my kids aren't threatened. I want to make sure they're not hurt by whatever it is. And you start talking about things that all kids are engaged in, like Halloween, for example. And then later on, especially in the 1980s, you've got a lot of people spending time talking about satanic symbolism in kids' TV shows. People are against Dungeons and Dragons and He-Man, and then Pokemon as you get later into the 90s, and Harry Potter and all sorts of other things. But there's this fear that is a right fear that parents have. They want their kids to have good influences. They don't want their kids to be influenced by things that are bad, and you shouldn't. So he's kind of feeding that with some of this, and he starts expanding more and more upon the satanic roots of various things in culture, which then gives him more and more of a following. Well, he makes a lot of money at this point. Warnke is decently wealthy. He's very popular when it gets to the early 80s. He's had best-selling books, and he's toured all over the place. He has supposedly these secret insights into who and what are controlling the world. But at this point, Warnke starts to overestimate the amount of lies that he can tell and get away with it. Which makes sense because he has gotten away with it for a long time. I mean, you're talking like 10 years he's been able to make these lies. No one's checked him. No one's challenging him at this point. He's just getting more and more popular. So he thinks, well, I can just kind of keep this thing going, right? So then to give himself more credibility, he starts to make up some things about his educational background that are not true. So it's not just the satanic background, but now when he's speaking about his qualifications, he also starts to make some things up that just aren't true. And as he gets increasingly more popular, the visibility of Warnke is growing. Eventually he hits the mainstream. And by mainstream, I mean not just in charismatic culture, not just in Christian circles, but he's actually featured on national television. So there is, let's see, it's on 2020 in 1985. There is an episode referred to as The Devil Worshippers, where they interview Mike Warnke. They interview him as an expert on Satanism, and he shows like the clothing and the rituals that the Satanists engaged in. And this was really popular, like this video, and you can find this on YouTube. I've watched it a couple different times. You can find a lot of the videos from this era. There's like stuff on Geraldo Rivera. There's Oprah did shows on it. 2020. There are tons of these kinds of videos from this time if you want to watch them, and you've got all sorts of wild stories that are going on, and it makes good TV. Okay, you got sensationalized stories, of course it's going to make good TV, and people are going to watch, because if you say there's a secret satanic group controlling the world and we've got the insider to tell you about, like, of course you're going to watch it. Why aren't you going to watch it? This is like the same reason people watch Ancient Aliens. I mean, there's no historical validity to any of the claims, but it's interesting, and if it were true, it'd be kind of cool, right? So the sensationalized stuff just does well on TV. So it makes sense that guys like Warnke are going to start getting picked up by TV, because they want good ratings and people are going to watch it because they like sensationalized stuff. So that 1985 feature on 2020 is really the first in a series, and so there are a number of other shows after this that pick up on this. But now all of a sudden, Warnke he's seen as an expert. He's interviewed on like a real television news show as an expert on Satanism. So this verifies what he's done. So now people looking at Warnke's story, they look at this and say like, okay, well, if some guy in your neighborhood's like, I was a former Satanist and I did all this crazy stuff, you're probably not going to believe him. But this guy's now been on TV. He's been teaching this stuff for years. Nobody's come and like debunked the guy. So, and now it's to the point that the mainstream media who's always accurate, of course, but that the mainstream media is going to him as a source to say, ooh, he's got the truth. It verifies his claims in the church. So his popularity just grows and grows and grows from this point forward. And it seems that Warnke probably thinks he's kind of unstoppable at this point, because like, wouldn't he have already been stopped? Like, how could he not? He's already like hit mainstream and he's just getting more popular. Well, that all stops. That all stops in 1991. So eventually Cornerstone Magazine, which is a Christian publication, they launch an investigation into this whole story that Warnke has spun in, starting with the Satan Cellar. So, and you can still read this, by the way. I've read through the whole investigation. You can find it online, and there are a number of things that they look into, but they speak to people who knew him growing up. They show that he wasn't in the places where he said he was, that he was not this orphan satanic kid. He was actually like involved in the church from his childhood, and it goes on, and there are all sorts of things that they discover, and this is the beginning. So other people do more research into this later on as well. So it becomes very obvious at this point. Now you've gotten to 1991. This Christian publication does what the mainstream media didn't do. It was actually look into this guy. and so this Christian publication, it rightly is like, okay, if we've got a guy who's influencing churches, we got to make sure that he's telling the truth. So let's look into some of these claims, because they are pretty wild and extravagant. So let's check. It's a good thing to do. We should do this. We should care about truth in the church. Like we should look into what people claim. And that's why, when Ravi Zacharias, before all the abuse stuff came out, the fact that he had lied on his resume about a number of things. There was tons of academic fraud. To me, that was actually enough to discredit Ravi Zacharias, but besides all of the other stuff. But for whatever reason, when we get this guy in a position of power and we see that they're influencing the world for good, or they're affecting the church, we just overlook stuff that we should care about, like lying, excessive lying about your qualifications. Christ is the truth. We should be people of truth. We are people of truth, so we should care about the truth. That matters a lot. And but regardless, and I spoke about that at the time. At the time there was a scheduled event that I was involved in getting someone from RZIM to speak, and I raised a bunch of concerns, which eventually led to that person not coming. But that was about this at the time, because I think it matters if you've got a guy who's coming to speak the truth, especially like an apologetics guy like Ravi, and he's there to like tell people that doubt the faith about the truth of Christianity, but he's made up stuff about his own story. Why should you believe anything else the guy says? So it discredits the whole witness of the person, and I think that's ultimately what you find with Warnke as well. So eventually he is found out. He's basically disgraced, and eventually he does. I don't think he ever totally recanted his story, as far as I know. He may have. Somebody can point that out to me, but at least from what I've seen, he acknowledges that there was exaggeration, and I think he does still claim to have a background within Satanism, or at least he did for a while. I don't think he's spoken about it in a number of years. And I've friends with him on Facebook, and I had never seen him post about it. So I don't know, but I think this is like 30 years ago now. This is a long time ago that all of this happened, and I think the guy just kind of put all of this behind him at this point. But it really did, like the stuff that he did and the claims that he made. Perhaps, I don't know what the motivation is. Perhaps he just said like, hey, I got the story. It's going to bring people to hear the message of Jesus. So that's good. I don't know. I don't know if that's his motivation. I don't know what it was, but it really did a lot of damage. It did a lot of damage to the witness and testimony of the church. And it gave, I think, a lot of secularists a good excuse to grab onto, hey, these Christians just make stuff up. Like, they just make up these supernatural wild stories, and none of it's true. You can't trust these people. You can't trust anything they have to say. So there's the story of Mike Warnke. So he's one of the significant figures in the development of the Satanic Panic. And so then the second of these figures is John Todd. Now, John Todd is like, this dude is wild. You could find recordings of John Todd. Every once in a while you see these on YouTube, and people still share them because people like share stuff without looking into anything. I've seen people share this and say like, oh, this guy has proof that the music industry is secretly controlled by the satanic cabal. And he talks about like conversations that he had with famous music artists and how they said they had to like sacrifice to Satan or make vows to Satan, in order to become part of the music industry. So John Todd he's the most wild of all of these figures. He is something else. He does get involved in witchcraft. So John Todd was he was in a Christian environment. In the 1960s, he was part of some kind of coven. So he was involved in witchcraft. And there are allegations of sexual abuse toward John Todd for as long as he's been old enough to abuse people. I mean, honestly, it's really horrific if you read the stories of what he's accused of. And it's consistently by a number of different people. Eventually, he is convicted of this. But in the 1960s, he's engaged in some kind of witchcraft and Satanism, which is, witchcraft is stuff that's going on at this time. And then throughout the 1970s, the guy's clearly like very unstable. And if you look at his life during the 1970s, he bounces kind of from religious group to religious group. So he's part of the Jesus People movement, right? He's part of that hippie Jesus People movement that we talked about, that Warren Key was also very influential in. And that is initially going to be the movement that he is very influential in himself later on when he starts speaking about things. Eventually, he kind of gets removed because he's kind of crazy. And then he goes to start speaking at independent fundamental Baptist churches because he's kind of lost his primary audience there. So he finds another audience because that's what these grifters do. So at one point he's preaching. Again, the Jesus People movement doesn't really have an emphasis on seminary training. There's a lot of lay preaching. So early 70s, he's preaching. People like him. By the mid-70s, now he has opened up an occult bookstore and started a coven and is accused of abusing people again. So he's bouncing back and forth between Christianity and then this, witchcraft. At some point, he's basically found out for trying to bring witchcraft into the church in some ways, and he's removed. He's kind of exiled. And after that point, John Todd has supposedly this conversion. And after this conversion, which he already had a conversion before, but now he has another conversion. And after this conversion, now he has this story to tell about his background in Satanism and in witchcraft. And so John Todd, by the late 70s, he had already kind of been removed from the Jesus People movement. So he's someone who he was an extremist, right? He was somebody who a lot of the people that would follow a Mike Warnke and listen to things that he said saw some of the weird stuff with John Todd, the abuse allegations, as well as the witchcraft that he brought into the church, and just some of the crazy stuff that he had claimed. And so they started to distance themselves from him. Now, when the Charismatic movement started to distance themselves from John Todd started accusing them of being part of a satanic conspiracy. So by the late 70s, John Todd had constructed this whole story. And this story has to do with the Illuminati. So you have really the beginnings of what becomes the modern Illuminati conspiracy, which stands behind things like QAnon today. And so John Todd is a significant part of that. Now, the roots of Illuminati conspiracies are somewhat there before that, but Todd really starts to make this a popular idea. So his claim in the late 70s is that there is this secret satanic group that controls major world events, and he refers to this group as the Illuminati. Now, he claims to have been connected to the Illuminati. He's an insider, so he has inside information that he can give. He also claims that this is connected to the Christian rock industry, and specifically the music industry in general, but also the Christian rock industry. So initially he's speaking just against the rock industry, then it's the Christian music industry as well. And so here he's like clearly cutting ties with the Jesus People movement, because they're the ones that start the Christian rock industry. And he's saying, no, that's actually all satanic. So he starts to make claims that popular televangelists, the Pat Robertsons and Oral Roberts and others at the time, they're satanic, and they're part of this satanic group. Nearly everybody's part of this satanic group. And it's again, similar to what you find with the Q types today that claim that, all sorts of people are involved in this global conspiracy. And the list keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. But that's kind of what John Todd is doing. And you can't really check these things. All you have is the word of John Todd to trust that he's the insider, so he really knows. So he starts saying things like, well, and you can find audio clips on YouTube that people are still promoting today. So look up John Todd music industry. You can find some stuff, and it's wild. So there are tapes that are sent around to churches. And I think that's also why he had an influence. At the time, it was like he'd record these tapes of these talks, and someone would record the tape and send it to a church, and they don't know who this guy is. They don't know how to check anything. They just see this tape, and they're like, some guy who's an insider has this information, and he's giving it to us. You got to listen to this. This also gets into Dungeons and Dragons. Now, the Dungeons and Dragons claims were Warnke made those too. So there are multiple people that speak about the Dungeons and Dragons stuff. That supposedly the game Dungeons and Dragons was based on actual Satanism and actual witchcraft, and that there was a vast conspiracy to really indoctrinate children with Satanism through Dungeons and Dragons. That was there. Yeah, there are all sorts of other things connected with that. Supposedly, there are kids who had died connected to Dungeons and Dragons, but there's a lot more to the stories when you actually do. But there's a lot of paranoia about this stuff. But part of those claims go back to people like John Todd, who claimed to have this insider knowledge. That supposedly they were. I think it was Warnke that said he was actually consulted by the creators of Dungeons and Dragons to give them satanic information so that they could include it in their in the development of Dungeons and Dragons. It's what Gary Gygax and I can't recall the other creator. Someone can tell me of Dungeons and Dragons. And then that goes into video games and comic books and cartoons on TV and all of this other stuff. Well, John Todd starts getting a popular following within a lot of independent fundamental Baptist churches. Now, I don't want to insult churches, but those churches are largely of those who are not quite as highly educated, so they probably don't have access to a lot of the things that they could use to kind of research stuff. That's just the reality of where a lot of those churches are at. And they have, a major focus on, being separate from the world, the evils of the world, the evils of rock music and stuff today, even still in a lot of those churches. So you could see how someone like John Todd's message would really resonate with those people. John Todd was also a prepper, what you think of as preppers today. I mean, he claimed that there was going to be this kind of major event that would lead to the end times where these Satanists would take over the country. So he urged people to prepare food and, just like, again, people do today. This is all still continuing today. Jim Bakker made a career after all of the mess with him and being a prepper and selling all this weird food stuff to like keep in storage because supposedly things are about to get terrible, then Jesus will come back. But as things get terrible, Christians need to prepare by giving him money and buying his disgusting looking giant barrels of food. So you find something like this with John Todd as well. So apocalyptic expectations, the satanic group that controls everything. It sounds a lot like some major movements that we've seen in the world today. Oh, and I forgot to mention this. Like, John Todd is behind a lot of the Chick tracts. So if you're not familiar with John Todd, you're familiar with the Chick tracts. Yeah, you've seen those tracts with the weird comics that, people that a lot of the fundamentalist Baptists or other types will. I think wasn't he Assemblies of God? I know he died recently. It was only a few years ago that Jack Chick died, and he was like very private. It's hard to find any information about him, but he was friends with John Todd. Now there was this back and forth in their friendship. He had kind of cut John Todd off at certain times, and they became friends again at other times. But they remained friends to some degree throughout the rest of John Todd's life. And so John Todd's claims, even if you don't know John Todd, those claims spread through the Chick tracts. And this also ties to some of the King James only kind of stuff, that there are these satanic groups that are behind the creation of the NIV and all sorts of other things. So this wild guy that should have zero credibility by any standard really has had a major impact upon at least a certain wing of the church. Well, John Todd's claims were not unchallenged. So he, unlike Warnke, he was challenged pretty much right away because the claims were so wild, and they also implicated all these other Christian leaders too. So I'm sure there was pressure on Christian publications to, discredit him too. So you have the Cornerstone magazine also does an expose on him and talks about his life and his back and forth with witchcraft and Satanism and then Christianity, and he just constantly is bouncing back and forth. Very unstable guy, clearly. Then you have Christian Research Institute does something as well. I think even Christianity Today publishes on it, and other. I think there are other publications. There was a whole book, and I haven't read it, but I know that there was a book published that details a lot of the details of John Todd's life and demonstrating why the things that he claimed did not actually happen. Eventually, he was arrested for rape, sexual assault, and he was in prison and died. So that's the end. That's the end of the John Todd story. And a guy that should just never have had any influence on anybody, but he has had a profound influence on the church and the culture because of a lot of the paranoia that we saw rise from claims that were completely unsubstantiated from John Todd. Now, the next major figure that I want to mention, I've only got about 10 minutes here, and I know I spent most time on Mike Warnke, but yeah, that's okay. So the third element, then, the third person that I mentioned is, well, there's a book called Michelle Remembers, and this is a bit more complicated than the other two, because what we have is not really a person who I think is a fraud. Well, I think we do have somebody that's a fraud, but not necessarily Michelle Smith. So the co-author of the book is a guy named Lawrence Pazder, or Larry Pazder. Now, Pazder was a psychologist, and Michelle was his patient, eventually his wife. Think about that. His patient, eventually his wife. Like the biggest no in psychology. Yeah, that shows you this guy's not reliable. He's not a good psychologist. You don't marry your patients. You don't have that as an option. This is like horribly abusive, and there are all sorts of horrible and weird dynamics about this. But they become major pushers of the Satanic Panic, both of them, and they're featured on Oprah, and they're on all sorts of other things as well. So 1980, this book is written called Michelle Remembers, and basically it catalogs these memories that had been recovered via therapy, specifically hypnotherapy. So Michelle obviously was a woman who had some serious psychological issues. She had some seemingly serious things going on that she really needed to see a counselor about. And this was something that was newer at the time, that there was a notion, which is not something that is believed by psychologists today, but there was an idea that the unconscious mind retains memories, significant detailed memories, that are repressed by the conscious mind in order to protect the person from the trauma that's caused by those repressed memories. And so there is a kind of hypnotherapy that the psychologist would engage in to try to bring back those repressed memories. So if you have some kind of trauma and you have some kind of trauma response to certain things today, and you don't really know what the root of that is, that hypnotherapy can help the unconscious mind reveal itself through hypnosis, that then what you can't intellectually normally remember, then you can express the things that had really happened. Now, to be clear, there certainly is, the brain does have defense mechanisms in terms of blocking out certain memories in certain ways. So it's not like it's completely all made up, but this kind of complete suppression of years and years and years and years of life that can then be recovered via means of hypnotherapy, that's not something that is believed or practiced by reputable psychologists today. Now, the memories that Michelle ended up recovering were of this similar to what we find in Warnke and John Todd, is a satanic group that supposedly she was a part of. Now, this group was in British Columbia, and supposedly as a child, and in these hypnosis sessions, supposedly she kind of reverts to childhood. She even speaks like a child, so she kind of embodies herself at 5 years old. That she's remembering that she was part of some kind of satanic group that she was initiated into at this young age. So her depression and other psychological problems were really the result of all of this abuse through this satanic group that she had been a part of. Now, this satanic group that she's a part of, it's not just a small coven, right? It's not the Church of Satan of Anton LaVey, but instead, this group is a worldwide movement. It's some kind of a worldwide organized movement that controls events in the world, that abuses people, that kills children, that forces people to kill children, that practices child abuse, causes children to cause child abuse to others, and it's really horrific stuff. I mean, if you read it, it's horrifying. I mean, you can't imagine that these kind of things would would happen, or that someone could even like think as horrifically as these things. But so Michelle did, and there are like 600 hours of her undergoing hypnotherapy. So it's constant. Larry Pazder, he is constantly doing this therapy stuff with her. Now, I don't know how much of that stuff that came out during hypnosis was related to this. Over 600 hours, it could have been a small portion of it. I don't know, but that's the portion that this book is written about. So under this then gives validity to what people like John Todd and Mike Warnke are saying. So once you get to the mid 1980s, you've got basically these three major figures who have really similar stories. So what the question is then, what are the chances that you'd have Warnke and John Todd both telling these same stories about this satanic group, and then you also have this woman just unconsciously giving memories of stuff? It's not like she's knowingly listening to those guys and then repeating what she's saying. So there is a lot of overlap, which is what I think makes a lot of people think that this is maybe something that's real. Maybe it's not all just made up. So this book is a huge seller. It sells very well. People are really interested in this recovered memory therapy at the time. It's something that's new, something that's now debunked, but at the time was new. People are exploring this and wondering, is there any real validity? Is there truth to this? Is this the way that we could deal with, treating people? This then launches this whole phenomena of recovered memory therapy. So after Michelle, this is popularized, and there are repeated instances of people recovering memories that are basically the same as Michelle's. They too were part of this satanic group. And then, if you ever see like the movie Hot Fuzz, I think that's a good movie to watch if you want to know about the Satanic Panic. Because like what happens in that movie is the kind of stuff that's made up by these other people. That essentially the people who are going through this start to implicate people because, hey, if they were part of a satanic group that's like murdering people, well, that's pretty serious and it should be dealt with. So they start to remember, well, who was part of this group? And their mind starts to connect people from their childhood to, the mayor of the town and my mother and my second grade teacher. They grab onto these people that were part of their life, and they're somehow in hypnosis, their mind is connecting the dots between these stories that they supposedly remember and people that they knew at that age. And all of a sudden now you have not just the person who's suffering, but now you have people being implicated for the worst crimes you could possibly imagine. And if it's true, it's horrible. Like if it's true, these people should be in prison for the rest of their lives. Something that's really odd though about a lot of this is like these people weren't prosecuted. Mike Warnke could be like, I killed a bunch of people, and like, okay, and he's just going around telling everybody. He doesn't have to turn himself into the police. After it's really odd, and something that's been pointed out by those who have done a lot of study into this time period that I think is really, really telling is all of these individuals all claim that there are these satanic rituals, these satanic sacred texts. This satanic group has existed for even prior to the existence of the church. Like they controlled ancient Rome. There is this organized group. But none of them ever cite anything from those books. Like, you really think that there's this satanic, the evil book that has been controlling people for generations, and not only has no copy of it ever been found in the history of the world, but none of the people that grew up on it and were taught those things all the time can even remember a single verse or something in it. It's weird. Like it doesn't accord with a real story. Like if you're raised with the Bible growing up, like I could cite tons of Bible verses just that I remember from my childhood. Of course, the books in the Bible, you know about it. But even if it's secret, this secretive thing, it's never been leaked. Nobody remembers anything about it. It doesn't have any connection to what would really be the case had these stories actually been consistent with reality. So anyway, that's what you see with Michelle remembers then. And same kind of thing happened with John Todd and Mike Warnke. Researchers went back and looked at the details of the story. And when they evaluate the details of the story, it becomes very obvious that the things that she had said did not correspond to reality. So the thing is, these people make constant verifiable claims. Like, they make claims that could be verified if they were true, of they killed all these people, where are the graves? They went to all these satanic sites, where are they? Show them to us. There are these satanic sacred books. Okay, what do they say? And none of it can be demonstrated. You get to, like, there are secret tunnels made underground to transport children in these weird rituals. Nobody finds the tunnels. So, like, where is all of this? You find some evidence of it at this point, if there really were this global organization controlling things. So I think it's important to talk about the history of this, because anytime we talk about the demonic, people are going to point out the Satanic Panic, and they're going to bring this stuff up and kind of accuse us, those of us who believe in the supernatural, being like that, right? But there's a lot more to it than just that. The story of the supernatural and the demonic is certainly a lot broader than these two con men, or three con men, Larry Pazder as well. Michelle, I don't know. I mean, I don't know her involvement. I don't know. Maybe this was all made up. Maybe she was really part of it. Or maybe this was something that genuinely her mind kind of created under hypnosis, because that happens. And by the way, when you do create trauma and memory is weird. You could make up memories and really think that they're true. Memory is not reliable at all. But the trauma that comes with, like, recovered memories, whether they're real or not, is real trauma. Like, you can have traumatic impacts of experiences that you didn't even have because now you remember experiences that weren't real. So it actually does a ton of harm to a lot of these patients. So I would be kind of gracious to those who went through this and were part of that kind of therapy, because it could be really harmful. All right, well, that's about the time that we have for today. It's an interesting part of our American religious history, and it's one that I think we should be aware of. And if you want me to delve further into it, I can. I've done a lot of reading and hours of watching all of the old documentaries at the time and talks from all these people. I don't know why. It's just one of these things that I one time had this like weird, I went down a rabbit hole once, and I think I was like sick for like a week with some sickness, and I was basically just in bed, and I like was needing something to do while I was just laying there. And so this was years ago. So I somehow stumbled upon this and like fell down the rabbit hole deep with this stuff. So anyway, hope you enjoyed this. Make sure you do subscribe here on YouTube and in the podcast app if you want to get more. And we'll see you in the next one. God bless.